Story 1. My mom's stories. My mother told me these stories, and she said they were true. My aunts have verified that they are also true. I have no reason not to believe them. When my mom was 15, her and her sisters needed to use the bathroom. They lived on a ranch out in the middle of nowhere in California. My grandpa was a ranch hand. My grandma, she used to feed just about everybody who lived close to them. Most weekends, she'd make big pots of meat, tortillas, the works. On this one night, after all the neighbors had went home, my mom said it was about 1 a.m. Her and her sisters had to venture out to the outhouse. There was no indoor plumbing. The outhouse was a little ways from the main house. She said the moon was out, just enough to light the path. It was a little windy, but not much. She said they were halfway to the outhouse when they looked up and saw someone walking towards them on the path. It was the path that led to the road. Thinking it was a neighbor who may have forgotten something in their house earlier that night, my mom and sister stopped to wait on him. They even waved. She said the figure was wearing a long coat, his lapels turned up, gloves, and a big, black, wide-brimmed hat that concealed much of his face. They stood there chit-chatting, wishing he would hurry up. It was cool. When the man got closer, they all turned to say something to him, but when they got a good look at him, they still really couldn't see his face. But when they looked down at his feet, there were none. The leaves were just swirling around where his feet should be. They screamed and ran home, with the figure following at their heels. They burst through the door and told my grandparents everything. My grandfather went out to check, and he found nothing. My grandmother said a rosary that night. My mother says that she still doesn't know who or what they saw. Sometime later, at a different house, my grandfather, who liked to drink his beer, used to drink rather a lot from what I've heard. My grandmother used to make homemade beer to try to keep him at home and out of the bars. The cops in the town knew him, and instead of taking him to jail when they'd find him drunk in town, they'd just drive him home. There were a few times when my grandfather would drive himself home, much to the dismay of everyone. For about a year, when they lived in this one particular house, my grandfather said he'd be driving home, about a block from the house, and he could see the house engulfed in flames. He said he would get sober up real quick. He'd drive home faster. He said once he'd get to the house, the flames would move to the backyard. He'd run, scared, to the backyard, and the fire would disappear into thin air. My grandfather would come into the house, chalk white and scared. My mom said that finally my grandfather couldn't take it anymore, and they packed up and moved. He thought it was some kind of omen. Nobody else would see this, and they thought he was just drunk. A year later, after they had already moved, they heard that the new owners were digging in the backyard, putting in a new well or something, and they found 2 little kegs full of old coins. To this day, my mother believes that the ghost fire was telling my grandfather that he needed to dig up the backyard, and instead they moved. Story 2. that room. I was working my regular 7 to 7 shift in the bone marrow transplant unit. There was one other nurse working. We had 5 patients on the floor that night, and it was about 3:30 a.m. My coworker had just come out of room 4. I actually startled her as she came around the corner. She had been emptying a urinal when the bathroom door had closed on her, which of course had freaked her out. She ended up spilling urine on herself. It happens. She proceeded to tell me that there was a young gentleman who had been in that room who had died a rather gruesome death. Evidently, this man was getting ready to go home. But one night, around 3:30 in the morning, the nurses heard a thump. The sound of someone falling. They rushed into that room. And this man was in the bathroom. Central line out. And blood everywhere. They coded him, but he died right there. A few weeks later, a sweet little old lady was in that room and asked the nurse if someone had died there. The nurse explained that this is a hospital and that it was very likely that someone could have died in that room. The lady said, "Well, a young man died here." The nurse asked her why she thought that, and the lady responded, "Because he's talking to me." Sometime in the middle of the night, the nurse went in to check on her, and there was blood everywhere. One of her lines had been cut. Not pulled out, cut. There was no scissors or other sharp items in that room. The lady was crying and said, "He did it, he did it." At this point, even the doctors are trying to get a priest or something to come in and say prayers in that room. Honestly, none of us like going in there anymore. Story 3. Our 1820s house. Until our move into this lovely 1820s house, we never really thought about ghosts. Prior to the move, my mom stayed there along with a friend to help us get the wallpaper stripped and the painting done. We were set to move in late May. It was warm and no heat would be needed. However, one morning, very early, which is unusual for my mom because she is a late sleeper, she called us at the house that we were moving out of to ask if we had left the forced hot water furnace on. We said, "No, we didn't, Mom. Why do you ask?" She said, "I'll tell you when you get here." Well, it turns out that she had heard the water going through the pipes, and the pipes were hot to the touch. And then she noticed a very tall woman standing next to the thermostat. The woman turned slightly, looked over at my mother, and then disappeared. Later, we moved in, and there were a lot happening, involving myself and my children. The youngest child when we moved in was 2 months old. By the summer, we'd have all the windows open and a cool breeze would help us sleep. One evening, about 7 or 7:30, I'd put my youngest to bed. His crib was on the driveway side of the house. He began crying. My mom was outside. She tried not to let the crying bother her, but she kept commenting about how he probably needed picked up, or changed, or maybe a drink of milk. I told her, "Mom, just leave him alone. He's been fed, he's been changed. He would just have to go to sleep." My mom disappeared, and I could hear a sound of her trying to soothe him. And, "Oh, sweet boy, Mom is in the room." And this was after I expressly told her not to bother the baby. As I approached the bedroom, I could hear the mattress squeaking, as if someone was gently pushing down on it and releasing. This continued until I rounded the doorway. My mother was not in the room. Actually, she was still outside on the ground level, and I was on the second floor. There's no way she could have gotten downstairs without me seeing her. Another incident. My oldest son had asked if he could have a friend stay over. The next morning at 5:30, I had got up, and there was my son's guest standing outside in the driveway. "Come on in, I'll make breakfast," I said. The friend looked at me and said, No. "Tell Jim that I'll call him later." It was years that passed before I knew what had happened. We had an old adding machine in the rear bedroom. One that you had to push the buttons, then pull down a handle to make it work. Well, all night long, the adding machine was being made to work. The guest waited until it was light enough outside for him to see, so he could leave the house. He never spent the night again. It's really strange, and I just don't understand. When I first entered the house with the real estate agents, I wanted to hug the place. It felt welcoming, comforting, like home. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the stories. If you did, give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and drop me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Bye.